Her skin bore the marks that had made the neighbors whisper behind her back. Marks they said were cursed, a warning of bad fortune. In the valley, the herd grazed lazily, unaware of the storm brewing in the human hearts nearby. Her family had always feared these marks, the streaks and blotches on her arms and neck that seemed to pulse like a warning. They said they were signs of the spirits, and in their fear, they had decided she was a burden too dangerous to keep. The morning had started like any other, with the sun rising over the distant mesa, painting the land in shades of gold and copper. Her father, once a man of quiet resolve, now looked at her with hollow eyes, the weight of superstition and desperation pressing him down. Her mother avoided her gaze, hiding behind the fragile veil of duty and fear, muttering prayers she hoped would shield the family from misfortune. Even her younger siblings, innocent and unaware, glanced at her with hesitation, sensing the tension in the air without understanding its meaning. It had come to this, the decision made before she could protest. They had chosen to leave her, to send her off into the wilderness alone, a sacrifice to whatever spirits haunted the land. Her feet sank into the dry sand as she walked toward the edge of the small clearing, where the wind carried a faint whisper through the canyon. The sky was an unforgiving blue, stretching endless and cruel above her. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of abandonment pressing into her chest. Fear had a new taste, bitter and raw, yet beneath it, something else simmered. She did not know what waited beyond the tree line, only that it would be the end of one life and perhaps the beginning of another. The sound of a distant horse's hoofs cut through the silence, steady and deliberate, echoing across the plain. She froze, every instinct alert. The presence was not threatening, not yet, but it carried a weight she could not ignore. From the ridge above, a lone figure emerged, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged to this land, someone whose eyes had seen more than most could imagine. The horse's coat was dark, blending almost perfectly with the shadows that stretched across the canyon walls. The rider's face was partly hidden beneath the wide brim of a worn hat, eyes sharp and assessing, not missing a single detail. She could feel his gaze, cold yet oddly protective, sweeping over her like a judgment and a promise all at once. He was a man of the plains, a figure the whispers of nearby settlements often spoke of in fearful tones, the feared Apache who had faced men and storms alike and walked away untouched. Stories said he was ruthless to enemies and unforgiving to fools, yet he moved through the world with a purpose that made even the wind seem to bend around him. The moment stretched, heavy with tension. She did not speak, did not move, only watched as he dismounted with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. His boots sank into the soft sand, a sound steady and grounding. When he stepped closer, the wind carried a faint scent of sage and leather, earthy and raw, tying him to the land itself. His gaze met hers directly, not with judgment but with curiosity, the kind that saw more than the surface. He had heard of her, surely the stories that had spread like wildfire through the small towns and homesteads, tales of the girl with cursed marks left behind as a sacrifice. Yet he did not turn away, he did not flinch. Instead, he extended a hand, a gesture that was both invitation and command, as if the land itself had chosen him to intervene where others had failed. Her pulse thundered in her chest. Fear battled with the smallest flicker of hope, the kind that had almost died under the weight of her family's rejection. She wanted to refuse, to run back to the edge of the homestead where the remnants of her life waited, but the truth was clear. There was no going back. Her family had left her to the elements, and the land had already begun to claim its due. Yet here was someone who did not see her as a danger or a burden. He saw her. That simple recognition, the acknowledgement that she existed beyond the superstitions and fear, sparked something inside her, fragile but fierce. He spoke then, his voice low and steady, carrying a strange authority that seemed to command the very wind. He asked no questions about her past or the stories she carried. Instead, he offered a choice, simple and undeniable: follow him or remain behind. The choice, though stark, carried an unspoken promise of protection, of survival in a world that had turned its back on her. Something in his eyes, sharp, unwavering, and somehow compassionate, made her decision for her. She nodded once, small and hesitant, yet enough to signal her agreement. The decision was made, though neither of them spoke the weight it carried. This was not the end of her suffering, not yet, but it was the first step toward something she could not yet name. The horse moved forward again, this time with her on his back behind him, the landscape rushing past in a blur of dust and sunlight. Her body tensed with every jolt and sway, muscles aching from the sudden movement, but her mind raced faster. Questions collided like bullets in a shootout. Who was he beyond the stories? Why had he claimed her when no one else dared? What awaited them beyond the ridges and valleys, in the untamed stretches of land where law had no reach and superstition held sway over hearts and minds? The wind whipped through her hair, stinging her cheeks, carrying the scent of sage and earth and the faint tang of something she could not name: danger, perhaps, or freedom, or both. As they rode deeper into the wilderness, the homestead vanished behind the rise of the canyon, leaving only the horizon and the unknown. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out like fingers, trying to grasp what was left behind. She stole a glance at him, the feared Apache, and saw not cruelty but a determination that chilled her in a way different from fear. He was a man who understood the land, who moved in a rhythm older than settlements and homesteads, a rhythm she was only beginning to sense. Every motion he made was deliberate, every glance calculated. He had faced death before, and perhaps it had taught him more than life ever could. The canyon walls closed in as twilight approached, deepening the shadows and bringing a chill that sank into her bones. Yet even in that cold she felt a strange warmth in his presence, a sense that he had chosen to walk beside her rather than leaving her to the fate others had decreed. They rode in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts, the only sounds the steady beat of hooves against the earth and the occasional rustle of wind through the sparse brush. The horizon ahead promised no comfort, only the uncertainty of open land and the threats that lurked in its vastness. Yet she clung to the small hope that this journey, terrifying and uncertain, could offer her something she had never known: a chance to belong, to survive, to exist without fear of rejection. Night fell slowly, blanketing the land in darkness that seemed almost complete. The stars emerged, cold and distant, indifferent to the struggles of those below. They found a small ravine to rest, a place where the land formed a natural barrier from the wind and prying eyes. The Apache dismounted first, moving with the quiet precision of someone who had spent countless nights in the wild, attuned to danger and survival. He offered her his hand again, helping her from the horse, and for the first time since her family abandoned her, she felt steady beneath her own feet. There was no comfort yet, no promise of safety beyond the moment, only the presence of someone who did not fear her marks, who did not whisper curses behind her back, and that alone was a revelation she could not ignore. She watched as he prepared a small fire, the flames flickering against the darkness, shadows dancing on his face. There was a strength in him that felt like an anchor in a world that had turned against her, a presence that filled the empty spaces where fear had once ruled. She wanted to speak, to ask him why, to demand answers for the stories and rumors, but the words caught in her throat. It was enough to be seen, enough to know that someone had chosen her not as a burden, not as a curse, but as a person worth claiming. And yet the night carried a warning, subtle but undeniable. Beyond the light of their fire, the world remained untamed, dangerous, and full of eyes that watched with intent she could not yet discern. The wind shifted, carrying a sound faint but distinct, like distant hooves or the scraping of something larger, something moving with purpose. She stiffened, heart hammering, sensing the first true test of this journey ahead. The Apache noticed too, eyes narrowing, hands brushing the edge of his weapon, ready for what was coming. He did not speak, his gaze locking on the shadows beyond the fire, calm but alert. She understood then that her survival, her future, depended not only on the protection he offered, but on her own courage, on learning to move in a world that had once turned against her. The night was far from over, and the dangers they would face were only beginning to reveal themselves. As the fire crackled, casting long, flickering shadows across the ravine, she realized the choice to follow him had changed everything. She was no longer a burden left behind. She was a survivor, a participant in a story that had only just begun, riding alongside a man whose reputation was feared across the plains. But even as relief mixed with fear, her mind could not escape the lingering question. What had compelled him to claim her when the world had abandoned her, and what awaited them in the shadows beyond the firelight? The wind whispered again through the canyon, carrying both promise and threat. The marks on her skin seemed to pulse in the firelight, reminders of what had been and what could be. The Apache sat across from her, eyes reflecting the flames, silent but watchful. The night pressed in, heavy with unspoken dangers, and the land stretched endlessly beyond the circle of firelight, wild and unforgiving. She knew the dawn would bring answers or more questions, and somewhere deep in the darkness, a presence stirred, patient and deliberate, waiting for the moment to make itself known. The first true test of survival had not yet come, and neither had the full truth of the journey she had unwillingly begun. Her heart tightened. She had survived abandonment, and now she would face what no one else dared. The fire hissed, shadows swirled, and the desert night seemed to hold its breath. The story was far from over, and she was no longer alone. The feared Apache had claimed her, and the world would soon learn why. The night pressed on, each sound amplified by the stillness of the desert. She sat close to the fire, the heat brushing her hands, but it did little to chase away the chill creeping along her spine. The Apache, whose presence had already shifted the way she saw the world, now moved with quiet purpose, checking the surroundings with the skill of someone who had survived countless nights alone in the wild. Every motion was deliberate, measured. She studied him carefully, trying to decipher the man behind the stories, the feared figure whose reputation had kept men and women alike from daring to cross his path. His eyes, dark and sharp, betrayed no emotion, yet there was something else there, something patient, like the desert itself, watching and waiting. She tried to speak, to ask questions that had formed in her mind since she had been claimed, but no words came out. Instead, she found herself observing him, noting the way he adjusted the small fire with practiced hands, the way he listened to the wind, to the whispers of movement in the night. There was knowledge there, a map of survival written into his every gesture. He did not need to explain himself. She could see the life he had led in the lines of his face and the confidence of his stance. Still, the curiosity gnawed at her. Why had he taken her? Why had he crossed the line of fear that everyone else had obeyed? The question hovered, unspoken, as the fire crackled and the desert stretched beyond in shadows and silence. He finally spoke, low and careful, a voice that carried weight without raising it. He did not ask her name, nor her story, but he spoke of the land, of survival, of the dangers that lurked beyond the firelight. His words painted a world both harsh and real, a place where weakness could not be tolerated and only those who understood the rules of the wild could endure. She listened, absorbing every word, realizing that what she had been taught in her home of superstition and curses was only a fraction of the reality beyond the walls she had known. There was a structure here, unspoken but clear, and it demanded respect and awareness. Her marks, which had branded her curse to others, mattered little here. What mattered was skill, awareness, and the willingness to act when the moment demanded. The firelight flickered across his face, and for a moment she saw a trace of something softer, something that hinted at a life that had been more than the stories of fear suggested. Perhaps he had loved once, perhaps he had lost, Perhaps the world had taught him lessons harsher than any curse could deliver. She felt a shiver of understanding, realizing that the fear he inspired in others was not cruelty, but necessity. In this world, strength was survival, and fear was often a shield against chaos. Her own fear had softened in the presence of his quiet command, and she understood, even in the dark, that this journey would demand more of her than she had ever imagined. It would demand courage, endurance, and trust she had never been able to give before. As the hours passed, the wind carried distant sounds, faint but noticeable, the scrape of hooves against stone, the cry of a bird startled in its nest, the rustle of small animals through brush and sand. He did not startle, did not rise, only shifted slightly to listen, every sense alert. She realized then that survival in this place was not only physical but mental. The land tested everything, measured resolve and instinct alike. Her heart, still tense from abandonment and fear, began to align with the rhythm of the desert. She had been left as a sacrifice, yes, but now, under the watch of the Apache who had claimed her, she was learning that survival was something more than avoiding death. It was about understanding, adapting, and anticipating. Every shadow, every whisper of wind carried meaning, and she needed to learn quickly if she hoped to endure. He spoke again, his words carefully measured. He told her stories of the land, of the clans and tribes that had once roamed these valleys, of battles fought not for gold or land but for survival and honor. He spoke of enemies both human and wild, of lessons learned in the harshest ways, and she listened, feeling the weight of history pressing down through his words. There was no embellishment here, no dramatization for effect. His stories were practical, direct, and full of insight, each one a tool, a lesson she could carry with her. In the flickering firelight, she began to see him not as a figure of fear, but as a guide, someone who could teach her how to navigate a world that had left her behind. Yet the tension never fully left. The night was too still, the darkness too complete, and every sound beyond the firelight suggested that they were not alone. He sensed it too, shifting slightly, hands resting near the edges of his belongings, prepared for any threat. The desert, she realized, was alive, full of unseen dangers that moved with purpose and patience. Her family had abandoned her, but the wilderness was not forgiving. She understood then that the Apache had not only claimed her, but had brought her into a world where the rules were different, where her cursed marks meant nothing unless they became a weakness in the moments that mattered. The thought made her pulse quicken, a mixture of fear and determination rising within her. As the first hints of dawn brushed the horizon, painting the sky in pale gold and crimson, he finally moved to prepare for travel. The night had been a test perhaps not of physical strength, but of understanding and awareness. She followed his lead, mounting the horse with care, feeling the rhythm of the land beneath them. He did not speak of what lay ahead, leaving her to wonder what dangers and challenges the day would bring. The silence was not uncomfortable, but filled with expectation, a reminder that the journey had only just begun. Every ridge, every shadow, every distant sound carried potential threat and opportunity alike. She remembered the villagers' whispers, the tales of curses and marks that had driven her from home. Here, under the guidance of the Apache, those stories seemed distant and meaningless. Yet they lingered in her memory, a reminder of what she had endured and what she still needed to overcome. The marks on her skin were still there, visible and undeniable, but they no longer defined her. She realized that survival, true survival, would not be given freely. It would be earned through vigilance, adaptability, and courage. The Apache had claimed her, but he had also set the standard. The world beyond the firelight would demand everything she could give. The terrain began to change as they moved, cliffs rising sharply from the desert floor, crevices deep and shadowed, and canyons that seemed endless. The Apache led with confidence, every movement precise, anticipating the difficulties the land would present. She struggled to keep pace, muscles burning and lungs aching, but she refused to falter. The first lesson of survival was clear: keep moving, keep alert, and never show weakness when the land and its inhabitants were watching. She was learning quickly that this was not just a test of endurance, but of perception, of intuition, of learning to read the world in ways she had never been taught. The sun climbed higher, burning away the chill of the morning but revealing the harsh reality of the desert. Each step forward was a negotiation with the land itself: loose stones, hidden dips, sudden drops, and the constant threat of wildlife or humans who moved silently through the vastness. He never allowed her to fall behind, yet he did not coddle her, demanding instead that she meet the standards necessary for survival. The fear that had once defined her was replaced gradually by focus, attention, and an understanding that her future depended on her ability to move in tandem with the world around her. The marks on her skin, once a curse in the eyes of her family, became irrelevant to the harsh logic of the wilderness. By mid-afternoon, they reached a ridge that overlooked a wide valley, the desert stretching beyond in waves of golden sand and rock. He paused, scanning the horizon with a practiced gaze, every sense alert. She followed, heart pounding, realizing that this was the first glimpse of the journey's larger scale. There was more to come: danger, challenges, and the unknown, but she was no longer paralyzed by fear. She had begun to understand that the world outside her former home required strength, wit, and courage above all. And here, with the Apache who had claimed her, she would have a chance to survive where others had failed. As they made camp again, the evening approached, the sun sinking behind the distant ridges and painting the world in shades of orange and purple. The fire was small, carefully managed, and the air carried the scent of sage and earth, familiar now and grounding. She watched him move, preparing food, tending the fire, his every action deliberate, honed by years of experience. She wanted to speak, to ask him questions about the path they would take, about the dangers that awaited, but she held back, sensing that some lessons would reveal themselves only in time. Patience, she realized, was as important as strength in this world. The wind shifted again, bringing with it faint sounds, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her pulse quicken. The Apache's eyes flicked to the shadows beyond the firelight, and she understood without words. The land was alive with threats and secrets, and tonight, as every night, they would need to remain alert. The first chapter of survival was behind her, but the journey itself was only beginning. Her marks, her past, and her abandonment were now part of a larger story, one that she would write with every step forward, every choice made, and every moment endured. And in the shadows, something waited, patient and deliberate, for the moment when the hunted and the hunter would truly meet. She shivered, not from cold, but from the realization that the world had shifted under her feet. She was no longer alone. The feared Apache had claimed her, but the land, the night, and the unseen forces beyond the firelight had not yet spoken. And when they did, she would need to be ready. Dawn came slow, painting the ridges in pale light that barely warmed the desert air. She rose from the small camp, muscles sore and stiff, the fire reduced to embers that whispered against the rocks. The Apache was already moving, scanning the horizon, eyes narrowed as if reading the land itself. He made no sound, only motion, and she followed, careful not to fall behind. The tension from the night had not left her. It lingered in her shoulders, in the way her chest tightened with every shift of the wind. She had thought the wilderness would be simple, empty, but it was alive, full of movement and sound that spoke of unseen watchers and unspoken threats. Every step was measured, every glance calculated. She realized quickly that fear was not weakness here, it was a guide. As they descended into a narrow canyon, the landscape shifted. Rocks jutted out like jagged teeth, casting shadows that could hide anything. The Apache moved with ease, barefooted against the sun-warmed stones, each step deliberate and precise. She stumbled once, scraping her palm against the rough surface, and he paused. turning back to give her a glance that was both warning and encouragement. She clenched her jaw and continued, understanding that mistakes here could be costly. The canyon walls pressed close, and with each echo of their movement, her pulse quickened. She thought of the villagers who had abandoned her, of the whispers and the fear, and wondered how they would react if they could see her now, navigating the land that had once frightened them with a man who had been more myth than reality. The Apache finally stopped at a small plateau overlooking a larger valley below. He crouched, scanning the distant horizon with eyes that seemed to see beyond the present. She joined him, gasping from the exertion, and tried to match his calm, but her heart raced. In the distance, dust swirled, faint but unmistakable. Horses, or perhaps wagons, human movement. The Apache did not speak immediately, only observing, noting the angle of the sun and the way shadows shifted across the terrain. When he finally broke the silence, his words were low, deliberate. They were travelers, he said, cautious, perhaps suspicious. Not enemies, not yet, but not to be trusted blindly. His tone left no room for misinterpretation. They would watch, they would wait, and they would act only if necessary. She felt the weight of his warning settle over her like a cloak, heavy and unavoidable. As they watched, a figure appeared at the crest of a distant hill, separate from the others. Tall, hunched slightly from a long ride, clothing worn and dusty, moving with purpose yet uncertainty. The Apache's gaze sharpened, and she realized instinctively that he was assessing the stranger with every ounce of his skill. The stranger carried no visible weapons, yet his movements suggested experience, familiarity with survival. Her heart tightened as she noticed the way he paused, scanning the plateau, likely seeing them as well. The tension was immediate, a silent conversation carried across distance and observation. She felt the old fear creep back, the one she had carried before he claimed her, but it was mixed now with a strange curiosity, a recognition that the world was more complex than her home had ever suggested. He finally spoke again, quietly explaining what he knew of the people beyond the ridge. Nomads, he said, traveling through the desert for reasons unknown, some seeking trade, others seeking advantage. The Apache did not trust easily, and he had reason. In this land, trust could mean death. She listened, absorbing his words, realizing that survival was as much about understanding human nature as it was about navigating the wilderness. His ability to read the world, to anticipate danger, was not just skill, it was instinct, honed by years of necessity and loss. She tried to imagine living like that, never knowing when movement in the distance could bring help or harm. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. The stranger finally made his way into a dry wash below, unsuspicious of their observation. The Apache remained still, his hand brushing the edge of his satchel, a silent reminder that readiness was constant. She wanted to speak, to ask what they should do, but he held up a hand, signaling patience. Observation first, understanding second, action only if required. She clenched her fists in the dust, willing herself to absorb the lesson, to move beyond fear and into awareness. Every step they took, every glance across the land, was a test, a measure of readiness, and she was only beginning to understand what that meant. As the sun climbed higher, the desert revealed more secrets. Tracks crisscrossed the dry riverbeds, subtle and faint, telling stories of animals and humans alike. The Apache pointed out faint marks where wolves had passed, where small game had fled, and she began to see the layers of life around them. Each sound, each shadow, each shifting heat wave became part of a larger picture. The stranger below moved with caution, but he was unaware that they watched him, unaware that the land had its own eyes, that danger could come from unexpected directions. The Apache explained in short words the importance of reading the land, of anticipating movement, and she repeated silently, committing the lessons to memory. The fear that had once paralyzed her began to transform into something sharper, a tool as necessary as the fire they carried. By midday they moved closer to the wash, the Apache guiding her silently down a narrow path where the sun was less punishing, the shadows providing partial concealment. She stumbled over a loose stone, and the sound echoed faintly, but he only glanced at her, a subtle correction, and they continued. In that small exchange, she realized the depth of his discipline. He did not offer unnecessary comfort, only guidance. She felt the weight of expectation pressing on her again. Survival was not about sentiment. It was about understanding and following the rules of the land, about acting decisively and thinking ahead. Her marks, once the cause of fear and superstition, now seemed meaningless compared to the challenges that lay ahead. As they moved through the wash, she caught glimpses of the stranger again, moving slowly, deliberately. He carried something, a bundle, perhaps tools or provisions, but it was impossible to see clearly from the distance. The Apache's eyes never left him, noting the angle of the sun, the texture of the soil, the faint dust that lifted with each step. She began to notice things herself, faint patterns, signs that would have been invisible before. The lesson was clear. The world spoke constantly if one knew how to listen. She began to feel a strange tension rising, a mixture of curiosity and fear, knowing that the stranger could either be a threat or an unexpected ally. The uncertainty itself was heavy, pressing down like the midday sun. They finally set up a temporary stop in a small hollow, hidden from view by jagged rocks and brush. The Apache moved with quiet efficiency, securing water from a small trickle and preparing a meager meal. She watched him, noting the way he carried himself, how he seemed in tune with the land, with every sound and movement. It was not just skill, it was understanding, and she realized how little she knew of the world beyond her village. She had been abandoned because of fear, because superstition had taken precedence over understanding. Here, she was learning a different kind of truth, one that demanded focus and courage, one that left no room for hesitation. Even as she absorbed these lessons, the stranger continued his slow progress below, unaware of the watchers above. The Apache noted every detail, how he carried his weight, the angle of his pack, the faint limp in his gait. He did not speak of strategy aloud, but she sensed it, the layers of thought and calculation that guided his every move. He was always ready for the unexpected, and she knew that they would soon need to decide whether to approach, observe further, or retreat. The tension hung thick, a reminder that the desert was patient and unyielding, that danger could appear where least expected, and that every decision carried consequences. As afternoon faded toward evening, shadows lengthened across the canyon, and the heat of the day began to soften. The Apache finally broke the silence, explaining that they would need to move before nightfall to avoid exposure in the open. She understood immediately. The land was unforgiving, and the stranger, whether friend or foe, added a new layer of risk. She felt her pulse quicken, a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Every sound, every movement, every glint of light became a signal to interpret. She realized that the marks on her skin, once a source of shame and fear, had no bearing on the trials ahead. Here, survival would depend entirely on her ability to act, to observe, and to endure. They moved again, descending toward the wash, keeping to shadows and rocky outcrops. She felt the weight of her own learning, the slow transformation from frightened girl to someone beginning to understand the rhythm of the land. The stranger below still moved, unaware, and the Apache's steady gaze never wavered. She sensed the tension building, the possibility that a moment could erupt into conflict at any time. The desert, she understood now, was alive not only with danger from the land but from those who moved within it. And she had been brought into its rhythm, forced to adapt, to listen, to anticipate. Night would come soon, and with it, the real tests. The firelight from their last camp had burned low, but in the approaching darkness, the desert would reveal its secrets, its watchers, and its predators. The stranger might pass them by, might notice them, or might bring unforeseen consequences. And through it all, the Apache remained a steady guide, his presence a constant reminder that fear alone would not protect her, that skill, patience, and awareness were far more important. She felt the weight of every step ahead, knowing that the journey was far from over and that every moment carried the potential for danger or discovery. The land itself seemed to pulse, holding its secrets close, waiting for the moment when decisions would have to be made and true strength revealed. She took a deep breath, feeling the tension in every muscle, and understood that the story of her survival had only just begun. Every shadow, every movement in the distance, and every step forward would matter. And somewhere beyond the canyon walls, unseen forces waited, patient and deliberate, for the choices she and the Apache would make. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with danger, mystery, and the weight of everything she had left behind. And in the silence of the desert, the tension grew, heavy as the heat and endless as the horizon, promising trials that had yet to reveal their full measure. The shadows of the canyon stretched long as the sun sank behind the distant ridges, spilling gold and crimson across the desert floor. She rode behind him, the Apache, her body tense from hours of travel and her mind spinning with everything she had learned. The stranger below had disappeared from sight, leaving only faint dust trails that whispered of movement just out of reach. She knew instinctively that he had not abandoned his path, only chosen a route that kept him unseen. The tension in her chest was a living thing, each heartbeat echoing the rhythm of the land itself. The desert had become more than a backdrop. It was a force, patient and unyielding, testing every instinct she possessed. He paused at the crest of a ridge, scanning the valley below with eyes that seemed to pierce the gathering dusk. She followed his gaze, trying to anticipate what he saw, what he measured. Every shadow, every rise of the land, every faint glimmer of movement mattered. He did not speak, only gestured with a slight tilt of his head, a command to observe and wait. She clenched her jaw, her pulse thrumming with anticipation. The desert was full of unseen watchers, and every second brought the possibility of confrontation. Her muscles tensed as she realized the moment was approaching when preparation would turn into action, when patience would yield to necessity. In the wash below, movement shifted. A faint silhouette emerged from the brush, cautious, deliberate. The stranger was back in sight, carrying what appeared to be a bundle, moving toward a small outcropping of rocks. The Apache's eyes narrowed, analyzing the distance, the speed, the weight of his steps. She understood then that this was no ordinary traveler, no mere nomad seeking trade. The careful precision, the measured pace, suggested purpose, possibly even danger. She felt a chill creep along her spine, the old fear blending with the new understanding she had gained. She had learned to read the land, to anticipate movement, but nothing had prepared her for the unpredictability of human intention. He spoke then, low and deliberate, explaining the possibilities. The stranger could be friend or foe, but the desert did not allow mistakes. Every choice carried consequences. She listened, absorbing each word, understanding that this was more than survival, it was strategy, a test of judgment under pressure. He instructed her to remain quiet, to follow without hesitation, to observe every detail of the valley below. Her heart hammered in her chest, a reminder that in this place, hesitation could be fatal. The tension was a living thing, stretching across the canyon, connecting them to the stranger in a web of potential conflict and consequence. As the last light of day faded, the valley seemed to shift under the growing shadows. She caught glimpses of the stranger again, moving with deliberate caution, pausing to scan the land as if sensing they were watching. The Apache's gaze never wavered, noting each subtle motion, the angle of his shoulders, the way he carried the bundle, the faint limp that suggested long hours in the saddle. She tried to match his awareness, every nerve alert, every sound amplified in her mind. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable moment when observation would become action. Night fell, and with it, the desert transformed into a place of hidden danger and sharpened senses. The Apache led her down a narrow path, shadows providing concealment, the distant moonlight casting faint silver across rocks and sand. She moved carefully, muscles coiled, breath steady. Every step could reveal them. Every sound could alert the stranger to their presence. The tension was unbearable, a pressure that settled in her chest and made her pulse feel like a drumbeat of warning. She understood now that the desert was not merely a setting, it was a participant, shaping the story, dictating the terms of survival, and raising the stakes higher with every passing moment. From her vantage point, she could see the stranger more clearly. He paused beside a rock outcropping, setting down his bundle and scanning the ridges with caution. The Apache crouched beside her, whispering instructions in low, deliberate tones. Observe his movement, note his patterns, anticipate his decisions. She nodded, trying to steady her racing thoughts, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down like the heavy heat of midday that had long since faded. Every instinct she had learned over the past days was now essential. She could not falter, could not let fear control her actions. This was no longer practice. The story of survival, of being claimed by the Apache and thrust into the unforgiving desert, was about to collide with the unpredictable element of another human intent on his own path. Suddenly, a movement in the shadows, slight but unmistakable. She tensed, her eyes narrowing, heart racing. The stranger shifted, and she realized with a surge of apprehension that he had noticed something, perhaps not them directly, but the disturbance in the land. The Apache's hand brushed the edge of his weapon, a silent preparation, and she felt the tension coil even tighter. The moment of confrontation was approaching. Her pulse quickened as every shadow seemed alive with possibility. Every sound carried meaning. Every second felt stretched, loaded with anticipation and danger. The desert had gone from silent to electric, charged with the potential for conflict. The stranger moved again, deliberate and cautious, adjusting the bundle on his back. The Apache observed, muscles tight, eyes flicking from shadow to shadow, reading the land and the man with a precision she could only strive to match. Her hands itched with the desire to act, but she held back, remembering his lessons. Patience, observation, action only when necessary. The stranger's intent was unclear, but it radiated purpose and determination. He was no ordinary traveler. There was something in the rhythm of his movement, a silent message in the way he measured each step that suggested danger or opportunity or both. They followed silently, moving from shadow to shadow as the night deepened, each step heightening the tension. She noticed every detail now, the faint imprint of boots on sand, the drag of a pack, the way the moonlight caught on rocks to reveal subtle paths and hidden risks. The Apache remained calm, but she could sense the coiled energy in his body, ready to respond to the first sign of threat. Her own muscles tensed in mimicry, the training of the past days crystallizing in the pressure of the moment. Survival was no longer a lesson. It was a requirement, immediate and demanding. Suddenly, the stranger stopped at the edge of a dry creek bed, setting the bundle down with care. He paused, listening, scanning the ridges as if expecting them to appear from nowhere. The Apache's gaze narrowed, tracking every movement, every shift of the stranger's weight, every flicker of light in the darkness. She felt her pulse surge, knowing that a single misstep could ignite the confrontation that had been building since dusk. The desert held its breath alongside them, patient, waiting, ready to witness the collision of paths that had been drawn together by chance, by necessity, and by the strange intersection of fear and courage. A sudden rustle to their right made her flinch, but the Apache only adjusted his stance, silent and precise. The desert was full of life, of watchers hidden in brush or stone, and every sound carried potential threat. She realized that the story they were part of was layered, complex, unpredictable. The stranger below was one piece of a puzzle, the land itself another, and she, the girl who had been abandoned, marked as cursed, was learning to navigate a world that demanded awareness, quick thought, and courage. The tension was unbearable, coiling tighter around her chest, but it was also a thrill, the kind that comes before a storm breaks. The Apache finally spoke, whispering instructions she barely caught. Prepare, watch, move. The stranger's bundle shifted, and she knew instinctively that the moment of decision was imminent. Every sense screamed that danger was close, that choices made in the next heartbeat could change everything. She felt a rush of adrenaline, mixed with the lessons of the past days, her mind racing to anticipate every possible outcome. The desert seemed to lean in closer, as if aware that the climax of this tense pursuit was near. Shadows lengthened, sounds sharpened, and every movement became charged with potential consequence. The stranger began to move again, carefully, deliberately. The Apache signaled, a slight tilt of his head, and she followed without hesitation, muscles coiled, senses alert. The tension in the air was palpable, every shadow a threat, every sound a warning. She knew now that survival depended on the delicate balance of observation, patience, and precise action. The desert was alive with opportunity and peril alike, and the stranger carried both in every cautious step. The night pressed around them, darkness full of possibility, the wind carrying a faint whisper of something unseen, something patient, waiting for the right moment to intervene. Every heartbeat was amplified, every movement a measure of readiness. She could feel the climax approaching, the intersection of paths and intentions, the potential for danger and discovery. The Apache's eyes never left the stranger, every muscle coiled, every decision calculated. She mirrored him, silent and precise, learning in real time what it meant to navigate a world that demanded more than fear and instinct. Every shadow, every sound, every flicker of movement added layers to the tension, drawing her closer to a moment that would test all she had learned and all she had become under his guidance. The stranger paused at the base of a rocky rise, kneeling to inspect the bundle, unaware of the watchers above. The Apache's hand hovered, ready, and she felt the charge in the air, the coiled anticipation that signals the verge of action. She understood now that everything hinged on the next moments. One misstep, one premature movement, could ignite chaos. The desert seemed to hold its breath, patient, waiting. The night stretched taut with suspense. She shivered, not from cold, but from the awareness that the culmination of all her trials, all her lessons, and all the tension built since her family had abandoned her was about to unfold. The stars began to glimmer faintly, silver eyes watching from above, indifferent to the struggles below. The stranger lifted the bundle, scanning the terrain once more, and she felt the full weight of the moment pressing down. The Apache signaled again, a subtle adjustment of posture, and she mirrored him instinctively, every nerve alive, every sense heightened. The night was thick, the desert a labyrinth of shadow and possibility, and the tension could no longer be contained. The moment was upon them, the approaching storm of action and revelation imminent, and she knew that the story of her survival, of her reclamation from abandonment, was about to reach its most critical and suspenseful threshold. The desert held its breath with them, every shadow waiting, every sound amplified, every heartbeat a drum of warning and anticipation. The next step, the next motion, the next glance would determine the trajectory of all that had come before. And as she crouched beside the Apache, her eyes fixed on the stranger below, she understood that nothing would ever be the same again, and the final confrontation, tense and unavoidable, was only moments away. The night was tense, every movement measured, every sound amplified in the stillness of the canyon. The stranger below froze, eyes scanning the shadows where they had hidden, the bundle clutched tightly in his hands. The Apache's presence beside her was steady, a calm anchor against the storm of adrenaline surging through her body. For a long moment, nothing moved except the wind whispering across stones, carrying the scent of sand, dust, and distant sage. Then, slowly, the stranger lowered the bundle, as if sensing the futility of resistance, and raised his hands in a gesture of peace. Relief washed over her like a sudden summer rain, but she kept silent, letting the tension linger just enough to ensure they were truly safe. The Apache exhaled, a low, steady breath, his posture relaxing slightly. He motioned for her to step forward, to approach the stranger, and she obeyed, each footfall careful and deliberate. When she reached the edge of the wash, the stranger's eyes met hers, wary but not hostile. He was younger than she had imagined, with a weathered look that spoke of hardship and long travel, yet there was something honest in his gaze. He spoke then, his voice low and steady, explaining that he had been following rumors of a lost caravan, a group of travelers who had vanished days ago in the harsh desert. The bundle he carried contained supplies, medicine, and messages meant for those who might still survive. He had not intended harm, only to find those in need and offer aid. She nodded slowly, the weight of understanding settling on her. The fear that had defined her past was gone, replaced with a cautious optimism, a recognition that not all who moved in the desert were threats. The Apache stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding, asking questions about the missing travelers, about the roads ahead, about dangers she had not yet imagined. The stranger answered with precision, offering details that would prove vital to their survival. In the exchange, she saw a moment of trust forming between the three of them, fragile but real, built on necessity, honesty, and the shared understanding of a harsh world. As the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the canyon in soft shades of gold and rose, they moved together, cautiously but with renewed purpose. The Apache led, guiding them through hidden paths, pointing out the faint tracks of animals, the subtle signs of shifting sand, and the safest routes across ridges and washes. She followed, her senses attuned, her body moving with a growing confidence that came from days of survival and lessons hard-earned. The stranger, now a companion rather than an unknown element, adjusted his pace to match theirs, the tension gradually dissolving into cooperation. By midday, they reached a small plateau where water trickled from a hidden spring, a rare gift in the endless desert. The Apache allowed them a brief rest, and she took the opportunity to look at herself, at the marks that had once branded her cursed. They were still there, visible on her skin, but they no longer held power over her. In the harsh logic of survival, strength and courage mattered more than superstition. She realized that the world beyond her village was governed not by fear of curses, but by knowledge, awareness, and the ability to act decisively when it mattered most. The marks were part of her, yes, but they no longer defined her destiny. The stranger offered water and shared portions of the supplies from his bundle. They spoke quietly, exchanging stories of hardship and endurance, of loss and hope. She listened intently, realizing how isolated she had been, how narrow her life had been before this journey. The desert, the Apache, and even this cautious stranger had shown her that life was more complex, richer, and more demanding than she had ever imagined. Lessons of courage, awareness, and trust had been etched into her daily experience, and now, in the rare calm of the spring, she could reflect on how far she had come. The Apache, quiet as ever, observed her, eyes sharp even in the stillness. She understood without words that he recognized the change in her, the growth, the shift from fear to competence. His decision to claim her, to guide her through the desert, had been unconventional, but it had proven necessary. She had been abandoned by her own people, left as a sacrifice for reasons she would never fully understand, yet in his presence she had found protection, guidance, and the opportunity to reclaim herself. The journey had been harsh, relentless, and unforgiving, but it had also been transformative. As the day wore on, the trio began their descent toward a distant settlement rumored to be safe, a place where travelers and survivors had gathered. The Apache led the way, moving with the quiet authority of someone who knew the land intimately, pointing out hidden dangers and teaching her to read subtle signs in the terrain. The stranger followed, now fully integrated into their journey, no longer a potential threat but a partner whose knowledge of the missing caravan and hidden routes proved invaluable. She felt a sense of accomplishment mixed with cautious optimism. Every step forward reinforced her confidence and the skills she had gained. Along the path, they encountered remnants of the desert's harsh reality, dried bones of animals, abandoned camps, and signs of other travelers who had not been so fortunate. She studied them with the Apache's guidance, understanding the lessons hidden in each trace. Survival was a constant negotiation with the land, an ongoing conversation with the unseen forces of nature. She felt respect for the desert, a recognition of its impartiality, its unforgiving logic. It demanded everything, but it also gave opportunity to those who could understand and adapt. By late afternoon, they spotted smoke rising in the distance, a signal of life, of civilization. The Apache slowed, scanning the surroundings carefully, noting potential dangers, and plotting the safest approach. Her heart lifted at the sight, hope threading through the tension that had defined the past days. The stranger whispered quietly, explaining that the smoke came from a small settlement where survivors had gathered, sharing supplies and news. Relief mixed with anticipation. After days of uncertainty, danger, and vigilance, they were close to safety. Yet she understood that caution was still necessary, that the final steps of the journey could still hold surprises. They approached the settlement cautiously, keeping to the cover of rocks and brush, and she marveled at how far she had come. The Apache's guidance had taught her more than survival. It had instilled a sense of awareness, adaptability, and strength. She could move with purpose, read the land and people, and anticipate risks in a way she had never imagined possible. The stranger, now walking beside her with evident respect for both her and the Apache, seemed to acknowledge the transformation as well. They were a team forged in necessity, trust, and observation guiding their every action. As they stepped into the open toward the settlement, villagers began to appear, cautiously observing the newcomers. The Apache's presence commanded respect without fear, and she followed his lead, shoulders squared, gaze steady. The stranger explained their journey briefly, recounting the missing caravan and the hardships they had faced. The villagers listened, offering food, water, and shelter, and she felt the tension ease in a way that felt almost unnatural after so many days in the desert. Here, among people who had endured as they had, she felt a sense of belonging, however tentative. That night, by the warmth of a campfire set within the safe confines of the settlement, she reflected on the journey. The marks on her skin, the reason for her abandonment, seemed distant now, irrelevant to the life she had reclaimed. She realized that courage, awareness, and trust had mattered far more than superstition. The Apache, sitting nearby with a quiet satisfaction in his eyes, had given her more than protection. He had given her the tools to survive, to navigate, and to thrive. The stranger, now sharing stories of his own endurance, had become an ally, a companion whose presence had reinforced the lessons she had learned. As the fire flickered and the desert wind whispered through the edges of the settlement, she understood that her past would always be part of her, but it no longer dictated her future. She had survived the desert, confronted fear and uncertainty, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware. The Apache's guidance had been the catalyst, the spark that allowed her to reclaim agency over her life. And in the stranger, she had found proof that trust, once carefully earned, could turn potential conflict into cooperation and understanding. The settlement gradually quieted as night deepened, but she remained alert, knowing that life was never completely free of challenge. Yet for the first time since being abandoned, she felt secure, empowered, and capable. She had been left as a sacrifice because of fear and superstition, but she had been claimed by courage, guidance, and the chance to prove her strength. The marks that once branded her cursed now stood as silent reminders of resilience, of lessons learned, and of the journey that had transformed her from fear into confidence. In the morning, the Apache and the stranger prepared to leave, continuing their own paths. She watched them go, gratitude and respect filling her heart. The desert had taught her harsh lessons, but it had also given her a second chance, a life reclaimed from abandonment. She knew the world was still vast, unpredictable, and full of challenges, but she was no longer defined by fear or superstition. She had earned her place in it, learned to navigate its dangers, and discovered the strength she had always carried within. As she turned back to the settlement, welcoming the warmth and safety of human companionship, she realized that survival was more than endurance. It was awareness, courage, and the willingness to embrace change. The journey had been long and perilous, but it had led her to understanding, connection, and hope. The desert still whispered around her, but she now moved with purpose, with knowledge, and with the confidence that whatever challenges lay ahead, she could meet them. The fear that had once defined her life was gone, replaced by resilience, trust, and the quiet certainty that she had been given a chance to live, to thrive, and to claim her own destiny. And so, beneath the wide expanse of the desert sky, she stood tall, ready to face the future with the lessons of the past, the guidance of the Apache echoing in her memory, and the knowledge that even in the harshest of lands, courage, awareness, and trust could transform abandonment into survival, fear into strength, and uncertainty into hope. She had been left as a sacrifice, but she had been claimed by life, by resilience, and by the promise of a tomorrow she was now ready to meet. The desert no longer held her captive. It had taught her to fly,